a second. My recording is screwing up. There we go.
Looks like we're good to go, yeah?
Take it away.
Awesome, thank you. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for attending today. It is the Minnesota M365 Fall Workshop Day 2022 coming to you live from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Hugo and I are both here, and we'll prove it in the end. So feel free to @mention or tweet today @O365MN, hashtag M365 Workshop Day would be fantastic. And we'll give you some opportunities at the end to tweet out. Like I said, we're here live. Didn't know it was virtual, so we thought we'd come. No, we're just kidding. We knew it was virtual. We just wanted to be here. All right. It's Alive, animation techniques that bring to life SPFx and list forming, SharePoint solutions, and Power Platform. We clearly like to have fun today. My name is David Warner. I'm a Microsoft employee, also a member of the PNP team. I'm a community program manager for Power Platform, and I love interacting with the community and, of course, having a little fun, poking some fun at ourselves. We see things get spooky here. And with me, as always, Hugo Bernier.
Hey everybody, my name is Hugo, aka Corey. I am also a member of the PNP team. I also work at Microsoft as a community success manager, and super excited to be here. Anytime you want to get a hold of me, you can reach me at Twitter at BernieH, or of course you can just kind of stalk me on my Microsoft email address. But let's get back to David.
Awesome. Thank you, Hugo. Okay, everybody, let's talk about what our agenda is for today. We're going to dive right into some demos, no-code and low-code demos, along with some theory and reasons for animation. We're going to see some mo-code techniques. So you wonder, what's this no-code, low-code? So no-code is really, not using any code or maybe not having to write the code. We'll talk a little bit about that. Low-code is writing a little bit of code. And then what is mo-code? Well, it means you want to write more code. So we're shortening it to mo-code techniques. And we're going to talk about overall bringing your creations to life. What are the benefits? What are the strategies? What are the techniques? What are the purposes that you're going to want to use animation in your Power Platform, in your list formatting, or in your SharePoint Framework solutions? So as I mentioned, let's have some fun. Clearly, we're taking this off of Young Frankenstein, and clearly we're willing to make fun of ourselves. We have no hesitancy or ego involved here, so let's have some fun together. Ask some questions in the chat if you have any. And let's talk about no-code techniques. So when you think about no-code techniques, what do you think about? A lot of people think, well, how can software include no-code techniques? Well, you're right. It's a little bit of a lie, I feel like, when people say no-code, but maybe it's a stretch lie, right? Maybe it's, well, if you can actually copy and paste someone else's code, are you writing it? Probably not. But that is utilizing no-code for yourself. You're able to go take some code that someone else has written, whether it be CSS or JavaScript, copy, paste it, learn from it, apply it, alter it, improve upon it, change it. Yeah, that might be a little bit of no code opportunity there. Everything really has code behind the scenes, right? But if you can copy and paste, maybe that's the best use case of actually implementing what might be considered no code. So don't ever feel like, well, okay, that's always a lie. Just know that it's a step process, and you can start out with what would be conceived here or perceived as no code and copying and pasting. And we're going to show you how you can be empowered to do that today. You will walk away with tools and resources that you can absolutely employ in any of these no code scenarios. So with that, we're going to dive directly into some no code demos together. So I'm going to open up a browser here, and we're going to take a look at what is a list formatting. So we're looking at list formatting. If you're not familiar with what list or list formatting is, it's simply just overriding the presentation layer. So what I have here is a list web part. It's an out-of-the-box web part. It is simply loaded onto a page, right? So if I edit this page and I edit this particular web part, you can see it's nothing more than a list, pointing at a list, pointing at a view, and that view has had a list formatting style or definition assigned to it. Pretty simple, hiding the command bar, hiding the see all. And what we've done is we've really just taken what kind of looks like Polaroids, right? They're kind of coming back in style now with the kids getting those Polaroid cameras and instant printing or instant picture taking. It's a nice way to kind of showcase some people. But when you look at this, really it looks, I don't know, maybe unrealistic, inauthentic. No one ever lays on the table Polaroids in such precision in terms of space between them and tilt, right? There's always, kind of some degree of imperfection when you lay them. And maybe that's something that we want to employ. Well, it might not be that easy to do with just simply your list formatting definition, because within that list formatting, it uses what's called inline styles. Now, what we're going to employ in this no-code technique is nothing more than CSS. And we're going to talk about how you can take a lot of these techniques and automate them in the process. So we're going to sprinkle that in throughout and call that out where you can do that. For now, we're going to focus in this no-code area really just on presentation layer and how you can take advantage of giving a perception of more reality in your solution and or list formatting definition. So what we would like to do is we'd like to override some of the things here to apply that. Now, we could certainly go into our list formatting definition and write a bunch of inline styles that do some sort of randomization or some sort of tilting or rotation on any of these. But because list formatting is really just an iteration of our list items, it might be hard to do that for each and individual Polaroid, because it's going to treat each Polaroid as just a list item and it's going to apply that list formatting definition to all of them. So what could you do? Well, there's a web part out there called the Enhanced List Formatting web part. I'm on a laptop now because there we go. Enhanced List Formatting web part. This is a free web part. It's not out of the box, but it is free, and we'll give you some resources on where you can get it. It is with great power comes great responsibility web part. What it does is it allows you to put CSS on the page upon which this web part is dropped. Now, you may think, hold on, I've heard that that's against the rules, that you're going to inject CSS on an individual page, and then you're going to override CSS on the page. That's not allowed. And as a general rule, you're absolutely right. And that's why we actually put this little GPS warning here, right? When you get in the car and you turn on GPS, you start driving, and it says, oh, hey, promise us that you won't try to play with this thing while you're driving and crash and hurt yourself. We're kind of saying the same thing here, right? It should only be used to enhance your own custom HTML. Your own custom HTML. What is that? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. If you misuse this, if you become the villain of the story and not the hero, you're going to result in loss of styles applied, broken styles. People are going to say SharePoint is broken, tears, nightmares, blue screens of death. Oh my, you do not want that. So changing code or HTML that you do not own is unsupported. Unsupported. So please understand that you only want to control the custom HTML that you own. Now, what is that? Well, that's that list formatting, right? So when you create list formatting definitions, what happens is you actually can create class names within those list formatting definitions, and those class names are exposed here directly on the page. Are those class names that Microsoft will change? Absolutely not. Those are class names, CSS, that you own, that you control. So they're going to be exposed. The only time they're going to change is if you change them. So those are very, very extendable, meaning that you can use a web part like this. We're going to say we accept, and then we can see we add custom styles, and what it does is it has this little panel on the right. You can override those custom class names because you own them. The only way they're going to change is if you change them. And what's great is here you're scoping the CSS. Now, if you're a SharePoint Framework developer or you understand the extensibility of SharePoint Framework, you absolutely could create an extension that has a bunch of styles. I've done that in the past for things like iconography, which is great. It may be something small and you want it to be available globally, but perhaps there's more scoped purpose or scope techniques that you'd like to apply. You don't want that CSS polluting your page, every page in the solution. You only want it to be applied on certain pages. So this is a prime example of how you could do that. We're going to place this web part on the page, and it gives us this nice little box here where we could write our own CSS. So I could say class name, and you can see that it's styled and has all that nice formatting to it. That's great. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste some CSS. Now I've got this off screen here, but I'm going to select that, delete it all, and just paste it. And you'll notice all I'm really doing is just pasting in some CSS. If you're not familiar with CSS, don't worry. Again, this is the perfect definition of no code because you didn't have to write this, but you absolutely can take advantage of it. And we're just doing things like, hey, we're taking Polaroids and we're applying some transform and transition to them, right? And then we're taking, every even or something like that. What we're also doing is we're using what's called pseudo attributes. Now, this is very explicitly something that you cannot do directly within your list formatting definition, because this little pseudo attribute right here, specifically hover, means that when we hover over an item, we're going to change the way it looks or is positioned or a box shadow or something like that. We'll see that in a moment. This is where the power of extensibility comes in. So we're able to apply click events. We're able to apply hover events. And that's the magic behind this CSS and this pseudo attribute, because we're now telling the HTML when this is hovered over, go do something. So that's really all we're doing here. There's no JavaScript involved here. This is pure CSS, which is just cascading style sheets and just simply saying, hey, we're going to adjust the way things look and feel. So I'm going to hit save. And you'll notice as soon as I've saved that, you notice something's a little different, right? Now each of these are just a little offset. So they may be rotated a little bit to the left, maybe a little bit to the right. Maybe in the case of between me and Hugo, I see I moved it down a little bit. Now it looks a little bit more realistic. There's a little bit more realism associated to it in terms of how the look and feel is on a page, and feels more familiar to it. It doesn't feel so forced or digitally perfected, right? Which is something that as humans, we notice. And if we notice the comfortability of an imperfection, it actually feels a little bit more real to us. It's an interesting scientific effect there, that imperfections do feel more real to us because we know that they're actually imperfect. And Hugo will talk a little bit about that perception later in terms of a variety of ways that you can control that perception in a value-added way. So this is not all, right? What else can we do? Well, let me add some more CSS. I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to come over, select everything. Oh, select everything that was there before. Delete. And I'm just going to put another thing in. All right. Oops. Okay. So now what's happened? Well, if we zoom in, we see a couple things have happened. It's gone from color to black and white. Why? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But we've also noticed that there is a font, a custom font that's being injected here, which, again, SharePoint doesn't quite support custom fonts at a holistic level yet. But we could absolutely apply a custom font here at the local level and the individual component level. And in this case, if you remember when you print out these Polaroids, what would you always do? You'd write a little information, who they were on the little front, the little box area, or where the location was, or something like that. And you'd likely do that in cursive or whatever your handwriting is. So now this gives it another degree of humanism to it, of imperfection or personalization, something a little more authentic. So it looks a little bit more custom made and handwritten. What about that black and white? Well, what's the intent there? Well, when I hover over, you can see what I've done is a couple of things. I've now utilized those pseudo attributes of a hover to change the zoom. So now I'm bringing Bo or Hugo or Michelle a little closer to what feels like the forefront. So now I've added depth to my page. I've zoomed in and brought the individual contributor here to a little bit more of the forefront, and then I've color shifted. So now I have, as a user, have taken action to focus my cursor on this individual contributor. What has that done? It's also brought more rich detail to the forefront. So not only has it zoomed in, it's brought it to life via color, which is fantastic, right? So again, we're talking about controlling the perception here, controlling the perception and controlling what it is that we're seeing. So it's a nice way to add a variety of, okay, this is kind of neat. I can hover over them and see the full color, and it brings it a little bit more to the forefront. So you're giving the ability to change the focus to the user. You're not making the choice for them. The user is making the choice, and that's important. We'll talk about that as well. But wait, there's more. If you call now, you can get another effect here. Well, again, all these things in this no-code area are simply CSS. So now you'll notice one more additional change has occurred there, right? I have added a heart to the individual Polaroids. So this is where we can start thinking about automation. So now, if I hover over it, it's great. I can actually still see that, bring it to the forefront. But now as I hover over that heart, you see I've got just a little animated sprite. So now it's like, oh, okay, cool. What does that do? Can I click on it? Right now, we're not going to click on it yet. We're going to click on it here when we move into low code. But you can see by simply using CSS, I've been able to add a degree of interaction, right? And it's a little bit of education or edutainment here that we're doing, right? So we're interacting. I'm hovering over. And now I'm, oh, cool, a little bit of animated sprites happening there as I hover over that. If I drop off and go over to Hugo, I do the same thing. Of course, we love Michelle, so we can do the same thing. But we're able to then potentially tie to the click of that, and we'll talk about that more in low code, the click of that, some automation. And what that is, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But again, all we've done here in this no code technique section is simply use CSS. There's no JavaScript here, so if you're not a coder, it's okay. Don't worry. We'll give you some resources in how and where you can take advantage of that. All right. Now, there's a lot of theory that goes on behind all this. And usually a lot of the request is, can you make SharePoint not look like SharePoint? We've gotten a little better now with SharePoint Online and the advent of that. But let's think about that, right? Who can use these techniques? Well, Hugo, tell us a little bit about some of these techniques and who might use these.
Absolutely. Let's just me take over here. There you go. We can see my screen, right? Awesome. Okay, cool. So let's talk about, first of all, who can use these techniques. Hey, anybody really that wants to build applications, but is not necessarily a coder, right? David and I both work for the Power Platform and Dynamics 365 Community Success Team. So we're obviously big fans of using things like Power Apps and things like that. So any Power users, non-developers who would want to maybe improve, the activity that happens when you want to trigger an automation process. But any UI designers or user interface designers, or SharePoint Framework developers could use these techniques. But let's talk about how you use them, right? So, because we don't just do animations for the fun of it. I mean, I don't do anything for the fun of it. I'm the world's laziest developer. Let's use the example of the SPFx out of the box web part, right? The countdown web part. The countdown web part actually is something that uses microanimation. You see here, there's a timer that counts down to 0. And they could have just put a time here and said, at this time, this thing will happen. But by using a microanimation here with a countdown, it actually brings my attention to it. It shows me that there's a deadline that's approaching, and it brings a sense of urgency to what we have to say here. So here, for example, I'm supposed to switch over to the next slide. But why are we using microanimations? Microanimations, right? Is because we want to convey information in a subtle way without being distracting, but we can also use it to do something else, which is change perception. And here's what I mean by that. One of the things that the reason why we use microanimations is because we react to animations as a matter of survival, right? And it is hardwired into us. If you see, I know this image is very low contrast here, and that's by design, but humans as a species, right, we had to adapt to recognize threats around us before it was too late. If I've got this predator here that's kind of staring at me, I should probably be able to react quickly so that I can avoid being eaten. And so there's a few things that our eyes are able to recognize. And one of those things are colors. We're hardwired to recognize colors really quickly, right? They're a good way to indicate that something is important. It's either to see some fruit that we should be able to eat, or to see a dangerous animal or something like that. We're also hardwired to recognize shapes. And that's why we see a lot of people that will quickly recognize face patterns, even if there's not really a face there, right? That's a phenomenon called pareidolia. And so whether you see, Jesus on a toast or an owl on a tree, it's actually something that we're hardwired again to, because imagine if there's eyes and a nose and a mouth that's actually staring at you from the forest. Those eyes, nose, and mouth are probably not there to smile at you. They might be there to try to eat you, right? The other thing that we're really good at recognizing, and this is where microanimations comes in, is motion. So see here, we have something that in nature we should probably pay attention to. But one thing that you may have even noticed, and I don't know if you're able to see it at this resolution, but there are some flies around the predator here, and I don't know. Can you see it, David? Yeah, not so much. But there's some flies, and even those tiny little flies, if we are able to see them, and they're tiny little things. So again, shapes, colors, motion are all things that we're hardwired to recognize, and we can take that to our advantage. And this is when we use animations. So when do we use animations in our applications? Because this is the automation track. So why would we talk about automation and animation? Well, let's give you some examples. One of the things that I could do is maybe I want to illustrate that an action is being processed, right? Because my problem is I want to know that maybe the action that I just did, I clicked on a button or something that's being done. So directly showing me that my click or my mouse over or something had an effect is actually great. It's a great way for me to prevent me from clicking over and over again. Um, Showing that that operation is in progress. So I just clicked, it reacted, and now something is happening. And please, please wait, right? So you see an animation here where it launches a rocket. That's a great way to show that something is in the process of happening. But the other thing that I should probably be doing, and we'll talk about why very shortly, is visualizing how long an action will take. Um, So for example, right, I just triggered something here that is, I don't know, causing, an API to be called, or it's launching a workflow. That telling me that an action will take a little bit longer is actually quite important because people expect things to be instant. So here's an example of an application here that combines some of these things together, where we've all used, adding Bluetooth devices to our phone, but here's a really cool example of someone who's done something where they actually show, and here I click a button. As soon as I click the button, there was a reaction, right? That's telling me, hey, I understand you want something to be done. But you're also showing me that, hey, we're scanning around, right? You see the little blue circle that's kind of going out of the phone to show, hey, I'm looking for stuff around me. And then as it's detecting stuff, it's actually showing me the things that are being detected. And then at the end, it's saying, okay, I've done it. I've added these things, and here's the results. So another concept that we use micro animations for is focusing, having a hard time today, focusing the user's attention on crucial things, right? So, and that's important because what we want to do is we want to boil down the information to what's the most important, right? So this is a weather app, right? So what's the most important? Is it going to be sunny, cloudy, rainy, snowy, sneezy, whatever, right? I want to be able to see that most important thing. There's other information that are also important, but maybe not as important as the most important point. So let's use a little example here. I'm going to play a video. Hopefully, this video is going to play well over Teams, but it's called the monkey business illusion, and you have to count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. So everybody, start counting. All right. So anybody can tell us in the chat maybe how many times the ball was passed? White players passed the ball? Well, the correct answer is 16. Anybody got 16?
So it was too fast.
Ah.
And is a little choppy, so we understand it's a little hard to see. But that's not the point necessarily, Hugo.
Mm-hmm. Did you notice something else? Did you spot the gorilla? because even if you've seen this video, about half of the people who haven't seen this video will spot the gorilla because they're so focused on counting the number of times that the ball has been passed. And so let me show you the gorilla. Hopefully it'll show well. And if you saw the gorilla, or if you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, right? But did you notice the other things happening? And let me show you behind the scene here what happened. So let's rewind. So this is the people passing the ball and everything. All right, let's take a look for a second. So we have the gorilla here that comes in as the players are passing the ball to each other. But we're also seeing some other things. We had some other people that left the room, and the curtain behind the scene changed. It went from red to yellow. And that's what, it's called the monkey business illusion. But that's some of the things that we can do with micro animations.
I was focusing on trying to find the dragon, actually. That's my problem.
So one of the things that we can do also with micro interactions or micro animations is making interactions feel more natural. Here's an example of I've got what looks like a conveyor belt with products on it. And as I'm moving the products, you can see the items are jiggling on the app as if they were on a conveyor belt, right? And then making things a bit more exciting sometimes is important. Like here, I'm switching between fries and popsicles and hamburgers. Just making things a little bit more fun is useful. And this is not just for gratuitous animation. There's a lot of things that we should do, but there's some guidelines. So let's talk about those guidelines. The first thing we should consider is how frequently we actually show things, because one of the things that we have to remember is, and David has an example later where he's showing a heartbeat, showing that animation over and over and over and over will become really annoying. Now, for the purpose of our demo, we're repeating the animations because we want you to be able to see it. But just remember that repeating an animation over and over is annoying, just like me repeating over and over. The duration of that animation is also important, because if the animation is too fast, people might not notice it. And if it takes too long, people might either not notice it or might think the application is slower. So let's take a look at time, right? And it turns out there's an optimal speed when you're creating the animation. Anything below 100 milliseconds, that kind of appears instant. Now, it takes about 150 milliseconds to 350 milliseconds for users to understand there's an animation happening. Now, and I want to make it clear, right? There's research that shows, I think it's as little as 12 milliseconds that it takes for people to notice something is happening. But it takes about 150 to 350 milliseconds to make a decision on whether you need to act with that thing. So if you make your animation last between about 200 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds, that's kind of like what we call the animation sweet spot. It's the thing that's going to ensure that every user is going to be able to see the animation, and it will register, and they'll be able to actually, again, decide to do something with it. Now, the other thing to consider is speed, right? Because the speed of an animation can affect the perceived performance. Slow animations lead to the users thinking that the system is really slow. If the animations are used to hide delays, by keeping the user engaged, the user will actually start perceiving a performance increase, and we'll show you that shortly. But loading animations actually can help the users keep be occupied with visual feedback as a result. And so people perceive that as being a shorter wait time. The number of cycles that you use for an animation as well can also increase the perceived speed. And so we'll show an example of this later, but like there's apps like Facebook, they use a skeleton loading skeleton content, right? So it's not quite the full content. It just shows what would be like the content, and then eventually the real content shows up. And sometimes you might not even notice that this is happening, and it makes the application look faster. And that's an elegant solution instead of using the traditional boring spinners. There's also another thing that we need to think about: accessibility. People can get motion sick. And so that's why, for example, since iOS 7, you've had the option to turn off things like the parallax effect on your phone, because animations can make people, and there's a whole story about why animations can make people sick, or motion sickness happens, but that's for a different presentation, I think. Uh, Animations should always get triggered by the user, right? By the user mousing over something, clicking on something, or even entering the page. That's fine. But don't just randomly start an animation. Don't do autoplay animations, because then you're likely to catch the user off guard. So when you're using CSS, for example, you might say, oh, okay, I have an animation here that pulses for like 1 second in an infinite way in every direction. But what you might want to do is you might want to add an @media query that says, if the user prefers reduced motion, use maybe a more subtle animation. Like in this case, I'm using a dissolve animation to carry an effect where maybe I want to bring the attention to the user without kind of making them feel sick. And by all means, please don't do this, right? Which is, I love this website, by the way. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely love this website because it is so cheesy, so tacky, so animated. But it's probably not the best way to get the user's attention, right? This is just too over the top. So why do we use animations, right? Again, we want to bring attention to the users and we want to distract them, but there's some really cool concept. One of them is time perception. So we can actually influence how people perceive time, because when we wait, there's kind of different types of waiting. One is called an active phase, which is, when you're doing something and you're busy, right? That's the active phase of waiting, and that time feels like it's going by really quickly. And then there's like the passive phase, which is like when you're waiting at the airport, or you're waiting at the DMV, right? Anyone who's ever waited at the DMV can tell you, like, even like time feels like it's running still, even backwards. It's like tearing the fabric of reality, because the heart of this is the difference between that objective and subjective time, right? That active and passive. Because objective time is what a clock measures, and a subjective time is how we perceive that time. So humans actually have a tendency to overestimate passive time by about 36%. That means, again, if I'm waiting 100 seconds, but I'm just staring at something and I'm not able to like get distracted, that 100 seconds will actually feel like 136 seconds. And that's huge. And that's MIT research that's identified that. Here's a real life example, because on my way here, right, I went through Minneapolis St. Paul Airport, and I was remembered of a story. So in I can't remember what year, but Houston Airport used to get a lot of complaints about like the executives at the Houston Airport used to get so many complaints about just customer relation issues, and passengers were just, it was an inordinate number of complaints about how long the wait at the baggage claim was. And so the executives in response were like, okay, we're just going to add more baggage handlers. And we're going to, for the shifts where people are complaining. And the plan worked, right? The average wait for how much time people waited to get their luggage fell to 8 minutes, which is well within the industry benchmarks, even better than most airports. But the complaints just continued. So they tried to fix this, and they were just confused. Why is this happening, right? So they did a thorough on-site analysis. They used consultants to come in, and they realized that the journey from leaving the plane to collecting the baggage was about 1 minute. But it took 8 minutes for the luggage to get there. So that people were waiting 7 minutes to collect their bags. So in other words, the overwhelming majority of the passengers' time was spent just sitting there waiting for stuff to happen. And again, we perceive that time as 30, what did I say, 36, 38, whatever, right? We perceive it as a lot more than what we really wait. So after discovering this, what they've decided was a different approach. They just moved the arrival gate further away from the main terminal, and they routed the bags to the furthest most carousels. So the passengers now spent a total of 6 minutes walking to their luggage, and then 2 minutes just waiting for their bags. And the complaints just dropped. So they actually, all they did is they leaned on the understanding of how the passenger behavior, walking versus, waiting, and structured their experience around that. And this is something that Minneapolis Simple, I can't say that word apparently. If you've ever had to collect your luggage, you probably had to travel a very far distance to get to your luggage. But when you get there, your luggage are there. Your luggages are there, or they're going to be there very quickly. And so there's been a study that's been done by VGet where they found that just an animation with just a boring spinny thing, for example, is actually feels slower than a custom animation. In fact, we found that people would rather wait or would be willing to wait twice as long for like a custom animation, for example, a custom loading animation. And the other thing too is that because this is supposed to be about automation. So automation, right? I click a button, I trigger something, and it goes and calls something behind the scenes, a Power Automate or Power Virtual Agent or something like that. But the problem is that if customers are complaining, they're like, "Oh, this, when I click on this, it takes too long." And you say, "Okay, I'm going to go improve the speed of it." Well, you can't really control how fast the APIs behind the scenes are going. You can't control how fast Azure is going to go get this information. And even if you did, there's research that shows that any time difference or time improvement of less than 20% are barely perceptible for the users. So you could work really, really hard to make your app 20% faster. People are not going to notice it. There's a minimum required improvement time, which is 30%, before people can actually notice something that feels faster. So let me show you an example here of how we can do that in code. I have a web part here. This is a web part that I did a while ago for a college where the students were allowed to upload their photo ID. Now, the students, right? These are the same people that we have to tell them don't eat Tide Pods, or don't get out of your car while you're driving to dance, a TikTok dance, right? So they had a tendency to upload inappropriate pictures, and so they had a person full time all week long reviewing photo IDs of students. So what we did instead is we said, well, we're going to call Azure. We're going to create a web part. You can upload your picture. We're going to call Azure. Azure is going to analyze the photo, and it's going to come back and tell you whether the photo is appropriate. So here's the first version of this web part, where we took a picture of me, and hopefully when I hit submit here, you'll see that there's a little bit of analyzing, and it comes back and says, okay, you are approximately 45 years old. You're not naked. It's a real photo, and so on and so forth. This is an appropriate picture. Now, here's the same web part, but we've done a little bit differently. And we're going to use a slightly better looking person here for the picture, where we just added a little scanning animation here. And it actually comes back and says, yeah, this person is appropriate. Now, that's unfair that it thought that David is 28 years old, but it was the same web part calling the same API with just a minor animation, and it made it look faster. Now, here's a different thing where we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to increase the speed at which we're doing the animation. And we're going to add a little bit more animation. So again, this web part took the exact same amount of time as all the other web parts because it's calling the same APIs. We've just added animation to make it look faster. Now, there's all other studies. Let me show you a progress bar here, and let's see if this works. So this progress bar, so take a look at the progress bar and pay attention on how long it takes. We've got a progress bar that's animating, you know, ta-da, completed, right? Now, let's just use a different version of the same progress bar where it's animating, but it's actually increasing in speed. Both animations took 5 seconds. But statistically, most people will perceive a rapidly increasing progress bar as 12% faster. And there's lots of techniques here that we could use to increase that perception and make people feel that the system is going faster. And that's actually something that David's going to show us with the low-code technique.
Awesome. Thank you, Hugo. So a lot of theory that we went over there, but valuable. It's important to keep a lot of those principles in mind, best practices in mind, why you're doing it in mind. Again, it's not just for gratuitous animation or entertainment purposes, but there's a lot of strategy involved there. So how can you put this to use? How can you put some of these things to use? So that's where we're going to start talking about low-code techniques. Well, what is low code? We talked about no code. What is it really? In many cases, it kind of feels like it's a lie because we know software runs on code. Low code, of course, is going to now utilize some actual code. So we're going to have interactive user-driven triggers, right? So mouse clicks, if you think about that. Hovers are there, but a little bit more reactive along with the mouse clicks now. We're going to use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but we are not going to use SPFx. Right, we're not going to use SPFx, so don't worry about that. And you say, well, how are you going to use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but not use SPFx? Well, let's dive into the demo. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with where we left off. Here's our no-code techniques. This was just a list formatting technique. But of course, what we're using here is the list web part. So what web part gives us the ability to utilize and take control of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that's not in the list? Because we know in list formatting, you can't use JavaScript. You can only use inline CSS. So those pseudo attributes that we showed required that enhanced list formatting web part. Well, the community has your back. There's another web part that is available to you. And you might remember a version of it in classic SharePoint, and that is the content query web part. The content query web part in classic SharePoint utilized XSL, and what it allowed you to do is it allowed you to render the HTML, the actual presentation layer, and then you could via either the master page or injecting JavaScript at the global level. You could have JavaScript running on your entire solution, and you had to marry XSL, which was always hard. And I don't know if anybody here used XSL when we lived in the world of classic SharePoint. It was a very confusing and restrictive model, and I learned to love it because I had to. But it was frustrating and confusing. In fact, I remember interviewing someone and said, well, we do a lot of content query web parts. How familiar are you with XSL? And they said, I use Microsoft Excel all the time. So people didn't even really know what it was. Fast forward to now the modern world of SharePoint Online, and the content query web part doesn't exist out of the box, which is a shame. But that's where the community has come in with improvements, actually. So here we can see here is a SharePoint Online compatible content query web part. This is completely deployable. And what it does is it gives you all the power of what came with that content query web part in Classic. So you're able to filter, you're able to sort, you're able to scope directly to a particular list. You can set how many records you want. All those things were available in Classic SharePoint. Where the game has been upped is now you can actually go cross-site collection, which is really cool. You couldn't do that in Classic. But what you're also able to utilize here is the ability to see and utilize what's called handlebar templates. Now, don't worry if you've never used handlebar templates. That's a fancy way of saying I want my presentation layer of my web part to be controlled by simply HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And we've got a little animation running here that kind of shows interacting with that. We're selecting our field. We're perhaps creating a filter on that. And then once we do all that, you kind of saw it a few moments ago, there's a template, handlebar template associated to it that is nothing more than HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. It's very similar to list formatting. List formatting uses JSON to take each individual list item and then applies that JSON to it in a repetitive format. The same thing is being done here with handlebar templates. So instead of using JSON, you're just simply using HTML. So you see right there, there's a collection of classes, right? There's HTML, and that just gets repeated for each individual item. So you can see that there's got the dynamic template there, and it's using that each item right there, which I just covered over. Let me see if I can, there we go. In the process of the animation, you can see it's you're able to control where that iteration occurs, right? So it's nice and simple. So that's what we're going to do as part of low code. Here, what I've done, if I edit this page, I'm utilizing that content query web part, right? We're using the same format. So what I've done is I'm focusing on my site here, same web, community contributors list. I've come down and not using any filters or limitations or grouping, but I could. I'm scrolling through and selecting some of the items that I need, things like ID, picture, title, right, to display that information that I want. And then as I scroll down, you can see that I've got the ability to edit my template, which is really the out-of-the-box template, but I'm not using that. I'm creating a custom template. We've got that URL right there, right? So I can point to somewhere else, and I'll show you this in a moment, but I'm pointing to the style library in my SharePoint Online site for a custom template. So if I scroll all the way to the right, scroll back in, you can see that I'm just pointing at an HTML file called lowcode.html. And additionally, I'm able to pull in other things like jQuery. Now, you may not want to use jQuery. Again, it may feel a little antiquated. We're simply trying to look at the base here of what you're able to do. So we're pulling in jQuery, and then we're also pulling in our JavaScript file. So now, if we're comfortable with simple JavaScript methods, we can actually pass our values into JavaScript functions and methods, do additional data processing to them, and utilize things like click events and the like. So what does that look like? Well, if I come back out of here and I come over here, I'm just already looking at that. You can see I've got my low-code.js. I'm just using simple functions, right? I've got an on pre-render, post-render. I'm able to call these functions and do something with them. So it's just, very simple little stuff here. And then here's my HTML. Oh, no, it's both my JavaScript and HTML. For some reason, it's showing both my JavaScript and HTML, but the JavaScript looks very simple. I'll show you that. Actually, I can just close this and go back to my low-code HTML and click open in text editor. And it's pretty amazing that you can do all this within the browser if you wanted to, really. So there's my HTML, right? Just simple styles, styles doing things, and then I've got my template right here, right? So I'm just saying for each of the items, I'm also calling custom. This is a little bit of a preview, right? What we call foreshadowing. I'm calling a custom function that is within my JavaScript. So a little bit of syntax here that you get to know with handlebars, but by and large, you can see here that it's pretty simple. You're really just looking at HTML and then looking at tokens to identify my particular fields. So if I go back to my low-code techniques, what I've done, I'm gonna just here discard. You'll see it looks pretty simple, but there's a few different changes. So what I've done is when it loads, you can see that if you look at the names here, I'm not using that custom font anymore, but because it looks a little easier now, I'm bringing them into view, right? So I'm doing that. I've still got my ability here to hover, but now notice what happens when I click on the heart. So I'm actually clicking on the heart. Well, it's now changing the CSS class name, and what it's doing is it's creating a perpetual heartbeat there. Now, again, as Hugo mentioned, you would want to just do this for gratuitous purposes. And if I was to click all of these, it certainly gets a little bit distracting, right? Now all of a sudden they're all beating at different rates perpetually. We do that mainly here for intent of the demo so you can see them. But your eye may be fluttering around the page going, oh, I'm seeing all of these movements and color shifts and size changes and all that, and it's distracting, right? So you might want to put a limit on. You click on it, you look at the amount of time it might take for someone to click on another one and limit it to only beat once or twice. Now, from an automation perspective, this is a fantastic example of being able to then kick that into Power Automate or some sort of automation where it goes back and says, okay, I'm going to favorite an item in this list, or I'm going to maybe select it as done, or something like that, right? So you're adding a little bit more intent and strategy to your animation. It's entertaining at the same time that it's actually doing something functional. And what's nice is that you're controlling the perception. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So one more version of the low code. We'll come back here. I'm going to my low code 2 page. Again, I'm using the content query web part. In this case, we're going to combine everything we've seen so far. So we've got the Polaroids, the colors. I'm able to hover, etc. But you'll notice that when I hovered, something slightly different just happened, right? Well, what happened? Well, now what I'm able to do is I'm able to add additional information. You may not want to overpopulate your page with initial information such as who this person is, information about them, calls to action, like following them on Twitter. But in this case, we're using animation to expose additional data, right? And you'll notice that that follow on Twitter is actually a clickable entity along with the heart still there. So even though I've used CSS to change what I see, so now as a user, I'm able to make the decision on whether or not I want to learn more about Hugo, or Bo, or Michelle, or April, right? So it's a great way to not overpopulate the page with content, but still provide access to additional content that is just in time as the user decides to make that change. And again, I can add calls to action on that are not visible there. You'll notice that it still slightly changes color as I hover over Hugo. You can kind of see the green and the color, green and the red in the little tongue there coming into view, as well as my heart is still clickable, right? So I can click that, and as it goes back and forth, that little heart still persists, which is a nice, cool little thing. So again, you're trying to look for intent. There's a degree of control and perception here. And again, at the same time, you might give them the ability to click here, read something, and potentially add other things that are happening. So as you click it, you might add a little progress bar right here, as Hugo was talking about. You might add a little piece of information, such as setting as favorite or whatever the case may be. And why might you be doing that? Well, again, because you're trying to control the perception. As we've talked about a lot here, it's not just for entertainment purposes, but you want your users satisfied. And that's really a degree of control here. As you're automating things behind the scenes, you're also trying to do a little bit of a smoke and mirrors Jedi mind trick, right? And ensure that they're not getting angry at the solution because it may be taking so long. Because let's be honest, if you're interfacing with APIs behind the scenes, you're not always going to be able to control the speed upon which those APIs are going to return data or return anything for that matter. So using all the techniques that Hugo had talked about can provide a little more of control of what that perceived value is. So we're going to talk about that in a moment, but let's wrap up on the low code here, and I'll hand it over to Hugo to talk a little bit more about that perception that can happen.
Thank you, David. All right, let's see if I can share my screen. Cool. Okay, so just do a quick recap here. We've talked about how for you to improve the perceived performance of your application, right? So you're calling Power Automate behind the scenes, you're calling APIs, you're calling things like that. Even if you make your app 20% faster, people are not going to notice it. You need to make it at least 30% or perceived 30% faster for people to think that the app is faster. And we've already shown you a little trick where even using something like a scroll bar, or sorry, a progress bar that increases in speed, makes it feel 12% faster. So we're halfway there almost, right? But there's some other cool things that we can do. You saw David calling the little heart animation, right, to call APIs behind the scenes and things like that. And he was using some cool animations. Here's another cool thing that you might not be aware of. So, right, let's look at a regular button, right? When I click on a regular button and I just click on it and it goes, and by the time I release the mouse button, is like right now, that's usually when the button comes back up, that's usually when I go and get the results. And then the APIs will come back and will, say, here's your results. But here's the interesting thing. The average time that it takes for people to click on the mouse button and to release it, that's about 150 milliseconds. So imagine if what I did instead is, here's my same button. I changed the color just because I'm fancy like that. I click on the mouse button, and when the mouse goes down, I go and get the results. And who cares if the user cancels the button, right? I just got 150 milliseconds of extra time to go get the results. When the user releases the mouse button, I display the results. I just made the application feel 150 milliseconds faster. But wait, if you order now, we can actually combine some of these techniques together. So if I use, again, a new button, and I go kind of click on the button, and when I click on the button, again, I just bought myself 150 milliseconds, right? But I click on the button and I add a 250 millisecond animation on the button, like the little heart animation, or coffee button, like coffee brewing or something like that. And again, that animation is 250 milliseconds. We're pretty much hardwired. We're going to be tempted to keep the button pressed as long as that animation is going at least one cycle. So now what I just did is I just got myself 350 milliseconds of extra time before I need to display the results. So the app feels like it's 350 milliseconds faster. That's kind of, again, it's cheating, you might say, but this is where we can start using more code techniques or mo-code techniques. And so let me show you an example here of one thing that I did with mo-code. So I went to a library called GreenSocks, right? And if we haven't talked about this before, I consider myself the world's laziest developer. If I don't have to write code myself, or I don't have to do work, I will tend to avoid doing work. So GreenSock is a library that does animations for you. And I found a code sample here that has a kind of a tile library, and it allows me to move stuff around. Now imagine that I had to build an app where I wanted to be able to, reorder a sequence of things. And I wanted to, when I change the sequence of things, the sequence of priorities, I want to go call an API. Well, just doing a little something like this actually is enough to distract the user and make the user feel like the application's faster. So here's the same web part that David has showed you, but now what I'm actually doing is I'm using a little bit of JavaScript, which we haven't been using really. I mean, we've been using some JavaScript animations and some on-click stuff, but here I'm able to actually go call some libraries to do some fancy drag and drop and moving stuff around, and I'm actually making people feel like the application is faster. And so if I show you how this web part is done, this is basically the same content query web part that David was showing you. And what I did behind the scenes is I actually call the GreenSocks, the jQuery GreenSocks for animation. I added some draggable thing, and I added my little code to do the drag and drop. Now you might say, well, where did that code come from? Again, did I mention I'm the world's laziest developer? I copied exactly the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript from that sample. And again, we make all this stuff available to you, but for the sake of time, let me show you another cool way to do this inside of SharePoint Framework. So if I go to SharePoint Framework, come on. So here's the web part that I've done here. And this web part goes and calls some stuff, right? And so I just add the web part and it does a site search. And you see that it's actually kind of slow, right? And it returns some site search. And this is a real web part that goes and gets results. Now, here's the exact same web part, but where we do things a little bit differently. We're going to do minimum viable content, basically, where I'm just displaying some content as soon as the web part drops. And I know that I'm going to get some results, more likely. I know what the results are going to look like. So I'm able to kind of render a skeleton animation here that makes the site look, or the web part, more responsive. And if I take the same web part and the same two web parts and I compare them side by side here, let's do that. So we're gonna, using the fancy sections. There you go. We got so two sections here. I'm gonna do the site search on one side that doesn't render anything until I get the results. And I got to do the minimum viable web part. And now, of course, I loaded the first web part faster. So let me just refresh the screen quickly. Okay, both web parts are starting at the exact same time. One displays content right away. The other one displays content only when it gets results. They both, you saw, they both took the exact same amount of time to get results, but one of them actually started showing stuff. It just makes the app look more responsive, and people react to that. So how do I do that? Well, in my site search web part, right, all I do is I got the code to render. When I render, I use my state to retrieve the list of things. So obviously my search results got stored in the states. And I just kind of do a div where I return every element that I'm going to be displaying inside of a div. Very basic stuff. Now, my minimum viable web part with the minimum viable layout, I do the exact same thing, except that instead of just directly rendering the results in the render web part, again, I load my results from my state, right? But while I'm waiting for the results, I'm using a shimmer object, a shimmer control. A shimmer control is actually something that comes from the Fluent UI framework. And, it's got some cool things that you can do here, but you use the shimmer UI as a way to ease the UI transition when you know you're going to get results. So it shows you how to use it, right, and all that stuff. But for the sake of time, I'm going to go back here to my code. And in my shimmer, all I really do is I have a custom elements group where I go get my elements for my site listing. And and that's what this looks like, by the way. So here I just basically return some just placeholder stuff. And there's shimmer elements groups and shimmer elements itself that allows you to render some placeholder objects with different widths and different heights and things like that. And that's what this is doing here. So this is one line here with some items in the line. And then I've got this other line here where I'm just rendering 3 examples, 3 results in my search results. So they all look the same thing. It's very basic, right? But here's, again, the magic is that it makes people feel like the web part is faster. So far, we've showed you low code, we've showed you, no code, low code, and mo code techniques to use micro animations. And David, should I pass it back to you? You still have some stuff to talk about?
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, mainly just the animations. So if you, I will, let me see, or the resources, I should say. So let me go ahead and share, and we'll talk about that. We've got some links for everybody to take home, parting gifts, if you will. if you look under your seats, you'll find nothing. But if you look at the screen, what you will find is, there we go. Can you move my face? There we go. You will find some resources that we would love to hand over to you to take home with. So that modern React content query web part, as well as the enhanced list formatting web part, those are available at the aka.ms/spfx-web parts. Again, these have been vetted. They're created by the community. Don't let that deter you. The repos, the GitHub repos upon which these are located in, are vetted and managed by Microsoft. So Hugo and I both have a hand in that. And so it's not just some random repository where someone may or may not, be putting in code to do Bitcoin mining on your machine while you're asleep at night. Don't worry about that. You'll be fine there. But it is open source, so you can contribute back to it, and which means that you oftentimes will get better support on it than sometimes you'll get from Microsoft, if I'm allowed to say that without getting fired. The resources we use for animation, GreenSock, as Hugo had mentioned. Again, we're not endorsed or sponsored by that or anything. It's just a really cool animation library for physics. I've done things where you can throw stuff around the screen and it reacts based on the physics of how fast you moved your mouse and all kinds of stuff. It's very, very cool. And then Animista, which I think that we may show a little bit of, or a preview of here if we have time, and it looks like we do. So I'll give you a little preview of that, is where you can get some copy and paste options with that ability to do CSS. If you would like to request additional resources here, or some of these links, we can send you the slide deck, as well as some additional resource files. You can go to m365animation.m365.ms, and that will give you the ability to just fill out a quick form. Any notes as well that you might have for us, or whether you liked it or not, we'd love to hear about it. You could also just scan that with a QR code on your phone, just kind of asking for your name and any notes and email address where you'd like us to kind of send some of these resources to. We'll show you in lieu of just proof. There's Hugo and I, and you can see we're even wearing the same shirt. So we just took this picture shortly before to prove that we have come to the Minnesota area because we love it. And there is snow on the ground, which is foreign to me, but not Hugo. I'm from Los Angeles. He is from Toronto, so snow is something that he's well familiar with. All right, so we do have a little bit of time here, so I'm going to spend a moment here and just show you that animistic control, because it is a pretty cool little control that you can take advantage of. So let me do that here, and okay, so you go to Animista and you just say try me, and it's got a very cool little interface. It's pretty simple. You can just click on the variety of things. You might want to start with what you're looking to do. So you can see there's basic, there's entrances, right? Exits, text, attention, background, etc. So if you wanted to say, for example, bring some animation to the forefront of something being brought into the screen or exiting the screen, you can kind of see that. So if I go on entrances, you can see I want to rotate in, I want to swirl in, I want to slide from the behind in, I want to roll in, right? You can see all that kind of stuff is there. If I want to do exits, I can kind of do some of the same things: slide out, roll out blurred, right? You can see that there's no lack of choices here for some stuff. If you want to do something to text, right, you can see there's blur, flicker. Again, some of these you wouldn't want to do, like the flickering here may induce some bad effects physically, so you want to be judicious with how you're using these. So you can see that there's all kinds of opportunity here. If you'd like to bring attention to something, right, you've got the jello effect or the wobble effect. Doesn't come with the soundtrack, but you could sing along if you'd like. The bounce effect, shake, flicker, stuff like that. And then, of course, you can adjust the background. So we're all familiar with that Ken Burns effect, where you can take those individual images, start kind of panning and scanning and zooming in, and it gives, as we've talked about all along, it gives an effect that time is moving faster. Something's changing on the screen, so your mind is distracted with that, and it may not feel quite like you're looking at the same thing for too long. So you're able to do it from the right, bottom right. So you may not say, I don't want to have to come up with all the effects of, based on where the focal point of my image is. Maybe there you go. That's a good one right there. If you're trying to show the dome, Ken Burns top left. And then you can also see over here for all of these on the left, there's some options, right? So you could absolutely kind of adjust things, the way that it's going to time itself, the duration of it, the delay of it. Is it going to be infinite, or do you want to maybe repeat it a couple of times? Things like the direction, right? So I could say, you know, I actually would like that to take, 10 seconds. And I'd like to change the linear equation there, right? And that kind of stuff. Is it going to be linear? Is it going to ease out, ease in? Change that to ease in. You can see that it's moving a little slower, right? And then it'll speed up a bit as it gets closer to the end. There you go. So that's that effect that Hugo said. Like, we're starting slow, but we're kind of moving in a little faster. And that certainly didn't feel like 10 seconds to me. So you can take advantage of that. Now you say, that's great, cool. How does all that occur, right? If I go back to that again, that Ken Burns, and I say, okay, I want to do that. I want to do top left. I want to do ease in, right? How can I take advantage of using this effect? Well, right over here on the right side of the screen is a little curly brace icon. If you click on that, it gives you everything you need. So you can see you've got the class names, right? Animations that you need right there. So you can copy that. You can copy that class and then go paste it somewhere. And then that's only one part of it. If you scroll down, you can actually see this is where the actual keyframe. So in animation, you create keyframes. And so you can see that a lot of this is being repetitive. What it's doing is it's just changing from 0%, right, to 100%. So that's kind of what's going on here, saying at 0% do this, and then move to what's 100% and do that. So it's changing the scale and the translation. So that's what kind of does that pan and scan, right? If you're not familiar with CSS, that's really all it's doing, is scaling it up 25%, 1.25, just some simple math. And then it's translating it, which is moving it. And then it's going from the origin to the top left. So that's kind of how that Ken Burns effect is happening. It's just simple math. And again, if this is unfamiliar to you, this is a great way to learn, because you can copy and paste this, and then you could come in and say, well, I want to change it. I don't know. I want to zoom in more. I want to go to 150%, which would be 1.5. And so you're able to kind of utilize all these things and put them into place. Now, you may need to go into your, say, list formatting is a great way to do this, because it's kind of easy to implement. So you create a custom class name on maybe an image that's going to show up in list formatting. And you would just change this class name to whatever custom class name you put into your list formatting definition. And then, this could technically stay the same, but you would want to likely change everything, or copy this as is and just inject this class name into your list formatting. That's probably the easier way, to be honest with you. And then you can adjust it as you want, right? But if you use it as is, that's probably the easiest way. Is just duplicate this class name into your list formatting, and then you can take advantage of it without having to make too many modifications. So it's a really cool effect. Again, it's available on all these things. So if I were to go back to basic and say I want to flip, right, I can come in here and again get the exact animation that I need. Makes it super, super easy to take advantage of. Hugo, anything to add?
Well, I was just going to say, and a lot of the animations that David is showing here may look familiar, because they're all animations that we've demoed earlier in our no code, low code, and low code. And that's the reason for that is we use the exact same technique that David is describing here. We found an animation we liked, we added it to our list formatting, and made it super easy. So again, today we showed you how we can use micro animations as a way to, really convey or demand the user's attention, to really help the user kind of focus on things, but also to change their perception of time and make applications look faster, more interactive. And there's one extra bonus is that, when applications are designed like this, there's something called aesthetic usability effect. So any applications that look better, that look cooler, people will immediately feel that it is also easier to use. So what just doing these very, cheating techniques, really, you're able to make your applications, whether they're SharePoint Framework apps, list formatting apps, or even Power apps, right? And including Power Pages. You can apply the exact same techniques and get the behavior that you want. So thank you everyone for your time. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out if you got any questions, you want to collaborate, or you want more details on the code samples we showed today. We're happy to help. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Hugo and David. Much appreciated. Everybody who's still in here, again, I'll be posting the survey link if you want to fill that out and provide your feedback. You'll also be entered into the drawing for the Surface Go laptop. Much appreciated again, guys. Thanks for joining us. Great content. Believe everyone's got a lunch hour coming up, so we'll see you back here on the automation track at 1 o'clock.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.